This video's to teach your nan the difference between these two forks. Back in the plush suspension workshop, welcome. And today, I thought we'd have a look at entry-level suspension fork and a high-end suspension fork and find out what the difference is. Because, and when you look at them, they look pretty similar. So what's actually going on? Let's take them apart and have a look. If you were to show them to your nan, she'd go, oh, they're the same. So this video's to teach your nan the difference between these two forks. And straight off the bat, just holding them, I can feel a difference instantly. This one, which is a Rockshox 35, a 35mm fork, pretty decent fork, spec'd on lots of bikes, but it is entry level. But I can already feel it weighs quite a bit more than this, which is a Lyrik Ultimate. That's this year's Lyrik Ultimate, which is a very cool fork with some very cool features, which we'll go through. Stick them on the scales. 2 kilos. Let's see what the 35 weighs. But yeah, 2.8 kilos. So there's a decent weight saving there. And especially in the lower leg, all that weight is actually being accelerated and moving up and down on the bike. So the lighter you can make that, the better the bike will handle, basically. So that's the most obvious thing straight away. But let's get inside the forks and I can explain all the little differences. Quick strip down, didn't take too long, couple of Allen keys, everything comes apart basically. And in that respect, the cheaper fork, the Rockshox 35, was probably a little bit easier to take apart. Needed less specialist tools, I'd say, to take that apart, but always the case with more expensive stuff. Things get lighter and more specific. But let's start looking at what the exact difference is between them then. So both cast aluminium lower legs, both have got bushes inside them and seals. What you'll probably find on the Ultimates is that there's a little bit more production time that goes into building the fork. They might even be built by hand, whereas these might be machine built. You can see that on the Ultimate, you've got a optimized arch. So all the weight has been cut out of the arch to keep it all as light and as stiff as possible. And that would have had some FEA work, some finite element analysis during the design to see where the stress points are, see where the hot points are on a computer and manage how much material they can pull away from the fork to make it as light as possible, but as stiff as possible. Whereas with the 35, that's very much just a lower leg that will do the job with the minimum amount of machining that they can get away with to get it to you at a price point. It's still very stiff, it's still very strong. It'll be fantastic on your bike. It's just got a little bit more meat in it, so it's a bit heavier. On the 35, you've got a quick release. Just makes it a little bit more user-friendly. Again, you could hear that maybe there's a little bit less precision. Whereas on the Lyrik Ultimate, fully optimized axle. So this is a Maxle here without a quick release lever. The other thing you'll see on the Ultimate is these push buttons here. And even though they're pretty similar forks, it's a really nice feature. And what it does is it releases any pressure buildup that builds in the lower leg as you use the fork. You'll get to the point where actually that air creeps into the lower leg and increases the pressure in the lower leg and the fork starts to get harsh. That might happen over an entire day, of course, of riding at a bike park or something like that. But with this, you've got an external release valve to get rid of that pressure and gain back some of the suppleness of the fork. So that's the lower leg. Actually quite a lot to talk about in such a sort of static component of the fork. The CSU, as we call it, the crown steerer unit, this one's pretty heavy and I'm pretty sure these are steel stanchions. Again, not to say it's not high performance, it's just not as nice as this. And that is so much lighter. That's really, really light. Again, super optimized crown, lots of machining here, really nicely made. That is quite a lot of what you're paying for, is these little tiny performance gains throughout every component in the fork, if you like. And that brings us on to air spring and damper. Rockshox 35 internals here, and we've got the Lyrik Ultimate internals here. And you can see straight away there's some red. And everyone knows red anodized parts are the best. In the 35, you've got this, which is your air piston assembly. So you've got an O-ring here and an O-ring here. And this whole assembly moves, so this bit's static, this whole assembly moves up and down and squashes the air in this tube. So that all sits inside this tube, and then you've got a top cap with another O-ring at the top. Whereas in the Lyrik Ultimate, this actually uses the stanchion of the fork, so the internal surface of the stanchion to provide a seal. That process, again, is optimizing the fork, that there's two seals, a seal here and a seal at the bottom here. This has got a seal head that moves up and down. This has got a seal head that moves up and down. But that is where the similarities end, really. The way that these two systems work is quite different. Positive and negative air chambers in both. We've talked about them before in other videos. The Ultimate air spring works more like a modern air spring. So it would have a bump, a swap bump inside the stanchion. Maybe we can see that in here somewhere. Maybe not. And as the piston gets towards that bump, the air swaps past this quad ring, this quad seal, which has got 4 high points, 2 on the top, 2 on the bottom, just to give it a little bit more surface area compared to an O-ring, for instance. And that would then regulate the air into the negative air chamber. The negative air chamber on this particular fork has got quite a high volume as well. Further on, down the air spring, is this little bit here. And this is a brand new technology from Rockshox. It's called a Buttercup. What that does is right off the top, just those tiny little high frequency chatter that you get when you kind of going really fast. There's tiny little bumps and stones and rocks. It takes that out of the ride and just smooths the fork out completely. If you didn't have it, those little bumps are working against the natural friction in the seal, and maybe it doesn't get going quite so quick. There's also some hysteresis in the system, so how fast and slow the air spring accelerates and decelerates. This helps to smooth out that transition between compression and rebound as well. So it really is a cool, clever little system. And in the workshop, we've always talked about, why don't they have that? And eventually they came out with these Buttercups. So let's take that apart now, and we can have a look at it in a bit more detail. Why do you build me up? Buttercup, baby, when you let me down. Mess me around. So that's now all apart. The Buttercup. Essentially what it is a plate and a bit of squashy rubber in a cup. And it's beautifully simple. Just completely decouples the air spring and the damper. It has one on the damper as well. And just allows the lower leg just to wobble around a bit, move around a bit under those little tiny high frequency chatter inputs. So really nice bit of technology, and actually if you ride it, it does work really well. Your hands aren't as tired on the bar, and I wish it was a technology that other manufacturers introduced to their forks, because I think it is really cool. Straight away, looking at the Ultimate damper, you can see the build quality is incredible. Again, nice red bits. But this time it's a cartridge system. It doesn't use the stanchion of the fork with the volume of fluid in. So much less fluid and a nicer kind of cartridge all-in-one system that you can take out of the fork and work on. It's got the Buttercup on the bottom, and it's got a sprung piston in here, the piston moving up and down. Now that piston and spring pushes on the fluid and applies pressure to the fluid. And the reason we do that is to help stabilize the fluid, to stop any cavitation. So any tiny little bubbles get compressed and squeezed so that they have less of an effect. The bigger the bubble, the more interference it will create in the damper. The damping properties of bubbles are pretty poor, whereas if you can compress those right down, you minimize the effect that they have. And that's what that piston is doing. It's stabilizing the fluid. A bit like having pressure in your rear shock in the damper, in the piston, to push on the fluid. This does exactly the same thing, basically, and that's a pressurized damper. We've pulled it apart, and I can go through all the different bits of this with you, because there's some cool technology in here. And you can see the main, oh, hang on. There's something in here. That's weird. What's that? Sometimes you do have this from the factory. They have these things. Oh. Subscribe. You should probably subscribe. If you're enjoying the video, subscribe. This is our seal head. So that's much like the air spring seal head. That's the bit that stays static in the fork, and the piston shaft moves up and down through that when you get bumps. That's attached to the lower leg, going up and down. You've got a glide ring, so a little seal that sits up against this damper tube here in oil. You've got piston, which on this one has got a lot more complicated architecture than this. And you can already see how much smaller it is, lightweight, precise, beautifully made. And this is where a lot of the cost goes in machining, precision machining all these little tiny pistons and things. Through the middle of the shaft, you've still got a needle and some ports, and that's still adjusted by, whoops, more stuff on the floor. That's still adjusted by a glorified Allen key. And again, by turning that, you're just moving that needle up and down. And that's for low speed. However, on this damper, we've got a high speed path as well. So when that pressure gets too much for all the fluid to flow through those tiny little holes through the low speed path, you need a poppet valve, a release, to get rid of that pressure. If you don't get rid of that pressure, what you get is a hydraulic lock. This is easier to explain on compression. So if you're hitting stuff really hard, you're getting really high speed impacts into the fork, and you've got no high speed path, no way of the pressure getting out of the way, it will just result in this spike, this instant kind of lockout, essentially locking up. And on rebound, we call that pack down. So a point where the fork compresses and then can't extend quick enough for the next bump. And you can end up with pack down. If I carefully undo this, you'll be able to see our shims underneath. And these are our high-speed rebound shims. And I can take these off. And in the top here, you start to see all this awesome machining. And you can see all these tiny little shims now. These are all the little bendy shims that form your high-speed valve. Now these flex out of the way when that pressure gets too much for the fluid to get through the low-speed path. And this is what we can tune. So we can actually tune the point at which these shims open. The compression damper, which sits up in here, is essentially exactly the same setup, just the other way up. So you've got a needle that's controlled by your low speed compression. Adjust that, it pushes the needle towards some holes, which restricts the low speed inputs into the fork. And then the high speed on this particular one preloads the high speed shims. So these shims here that I just showed you, when you adjust your high speed compression, essentially what you're doing is pushing on them. So you're adding pressure to them, which changes the point at which they open. That's all you're doing with that adjuster, is applying pressure to some shims. And we'll probably do a video all about that, because I could talk about that for hours and hours and hours. But essentially, that's what's happening in the damper. So overall, there's a massive, massive difference between the two forks. They ride really differently as well. The Lyrik Ultimate's very controlled, lots of adjusters. You've got lots of flexibility about where you can ride it and how you can adjust it to respond really well to that kind of terrain. The 35 rides really, really good considering the price of the fork, but under those high pressure situations, those high performance situations where you need ultimate control, it doesn't have the technology inside it to cope with it. So it's never going to be able to deal with those things that the Lyrik Ultimate can deal with. And all those things come at a cost. So you can see why when we move up from 35 all the way up to the Ultimate, you're getting better and better and better performance. But off camera, we were talking about marginal gains, and at some point, the price point to get that next step of performance gain becomes unreachable. And that's where you start to push into things like Rockshox Black Box program. And Black Box is what they do for their pro riders. And you'll see on pros, forks and shocks, they'll have Black Box written on it. And that is usually some kind of new internals that they're testing that will come into production in maybe 3 or 4 years' time. But you can rest assured the pros that are on that Black Box program are riding technology that's way more advanced than even this. So there's lots more to come with the bike world. There's lots more technology, mid-stroke adjustment, for instance, things like that motocross technologies have that I yet haven't seen in a fork or shock. So there's more to explore, and every year something new comes out. Every year I'm learning something different, but hopefully that helps you understand the difference between an entry-level fork and a high-end fork. But buy whichever you like, they're both good. Subscribe, remember to subscribe. Bye. Why do you build me up? Buttercup, baby, when you let me down. I say it all like I know what I'm doing, but really it's all just a ruse.